Christopher Lee. The name alone brings to mind Dracula's hypnotic gaze and Saruman's thundering voice. He was a giant of the silver screen, a 6'5" titan known for his professionalism, that booming baritone, and an aristocratic air that seemed from another era. He spoke multiple languages, and his life before acting was the stuff of genuine legend. A veteran of the Royal Air Force in World War II, attached to special operations units. It was a part of his life he rarely spoke of, adding to his formidable mystique. This was a man of immense substance, deep knowledge, and unshakable principle. But let's be clear about that title. Hate is a strong word, and Christopher Lee was far too disciplined for messy public feuds. Instead, he possessed something far more chilling, a quiet, unyielding disapproval for those who failed to meet his impossibly high standards. These weren't screaming matches. They were cold, professional grudges born from what he saw as artistic and professional betrayals. He revered his craft, and he had zero patience for those he felt disrespected it. So today, we're looking at the 6 names and entities that earned a permanent spot on Christopher Lee's blacklist for representing everything he stood against. You can't talk about Christopher Lee's professional frustrations without starting where his legend was born, Hammer Films. In 1957, Hammer rolled the dice on The Curse of Frankenstein, casting Lee's great friend Peter Cushing as the Baron and the towering unknown Christopher Lee as the creature. It was a massive Technicolor hit. The next year, Dracula made Lee an international superstar. His portrayal was a game-changer. It was aristocratic, magnetic, and terrifyingly feral. He brought a dangerous sexuality to the role that forever fixed the image of the Count in our minds. For a while, the partnership was golden. Lee and Cushing became the faces of Hammer horror, making over 20 films together and building one of cinema's most legendary friendships. But the shadow of Dracula loomed large. As the 60s wore on, the studio's demand for sequels became relentless. For Lee, a man of artistic integrity, it became a source of deep, simmering bitterness. The scripts just kept getting worse. Lee felt trapped, contractually and morally obligated to return to the role, not for the art, but because the studio would guilt-trip him, reminding him how many people would lose their jobs if he refused. He described getting panicked calls from the head of Hammer, essentially blackmailing him into showing up for another sequel he had no faith in. His frustration finally boiled over with the 1965 film Dracula, Prince of Darkness. The script was so awful, giving the Count nothing of substance to do or say, that Lee famously refused to speak a single line. In the finished film, Dracula only hisses. Lee always maintained he refused to say the poor dialogue, while the screenwriter claimed no lines were written in the first place. Either way, a silent Dracula became a powerful symbol of Lee's professional contempt. The final straw came in the 70s with Dracula A.D. 1972 and The Satanic Rites of Dracula, which plopped the timeless Count into modern London. Lee was openly disgusted, calling the films fatuous, pointless, absurd. He felt the studio wasn't just making bad movies, it was actively disrespecting the very character that built its reputation. After Satanic Rites, he vowed never to play Dracula for Hammer again, and he kept that promise. Hammer had given him stardom, but in his eyes, they had betrayed the art form he held sacred. If Lee's issue with Hammer Films was a slow-burning fire of artistic frustration, his view of German actor Klaus Kinski was a flash of ice-cold contempt. The two titans of European cinema worked together on a few films, including the 1970 version of Count Dracula. On the surface, they were both intense, committed actors. But that's where the similarities abruptly ended. Lee was the ultimate professional, a product of British discipline. He believed in punctuality, preparation, and respect for every single person on set. Klaus Kinski, on the other hand, was chaos in human form. He was infamous for his violent, unpredictable tantrums, screaming matches with directors, and abusive behavior toward his colleagues. For Christopher Lee, this wasn't the mark of a tortured artist. It was the mark of an undisciplined, unprofessional man. He saw Kinski's on-set meltdowns not as creative genius, but as pathetic, indulgent displays of ego. Lee played monsters on screen, but he had absolutely no tolerance for monstrous behavior in real life. During the filming of Count Dracula, the difference was impossible to ignore. Lee, playing the Count, was a quiet, commanding presence. Kinski, playing Renfield, was reportedly erratic and difficult. While Lee was far too reserved for a public shouting match, those on set described his reaction to Kinski's antics as one of quiet, simmering disgust. It was a fundamental clash of philosophies. Kinski seemed to believe that to play a madman, you had to become one. Lee believed that acting was a craft of control and precision. You channel the darkness. You don't let it consume you and everyone around you. In Lee's world, a world of honor and discipline, Klaus Kinski represented the worst kind of artistic fraud, a man who used the idea of art as an excuse for his own appalling character. Lee didn't need to feud with him. He simply dismissed him. Christopher Lee's relationship with Tim Burton wasn't a feud, but a fascinating and complex creative mismatch. On paper, they should have been a perfect pair. Burton grew up worshipping Lee's Hammer horror films, and that gothic style became the heart of his own filmmaking. When he finally got to work with his childhood hero in movies like Sleepy Hollow and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, it was a dream come true for the director. Lee, in turn, appeared in 5 of Burton's films and appreciated the respect he was shown. But behind the mutual admiration, there was a quiet, professional disconnect. It all came down to their opposite approaches to their work. Christopher Lee was old school. He wanted to dig into the script, discuss his character's psychology, and have long talks with his director about the story's meaning. He was a man of logic and language. Tim Burton, on the other hand, is a famously visual and intuitive director. He thinks in images and feelings. He's known for giving actors vague, impressionistic directions like more sadness or a bit more angular, rather than detailed backstory. For an actor like Johnny Depp, this was liberating. For Christopher Lee, it was often just baffling. Here was a man who spoke 6 languages and had mastered the power of words, being directed by a man who often preferred not to use them. Lee would come to set ready for a deep dive, only to be met with Burton's abstract, visual guidance. Principle he couldn't ignore, even in a friend. Christopher Lee's role in The Lord of the Rings was the source of both immense pride and one of the deepest professional wounds of his career. Lee wasn't just an actor in the trilogy, he was a lifelong devotee who reread the books every single year. He was also believed to be the only person on the project to have actually met J.R.R. Tolkien. He actively campaigned for a role and was cast as the wizard Saruman the White, a part he poured his entire soul into. For the first 2 films, his collaboration with director Peter Jackson was a triumph. But then came The Return of the King. Jackson had filmed a crucial 7-minute scene showing Saruman's downfall. Confronted by the heroes, he is stabbed in the back by his own servant and falls to his death. It was a dramatic, fitting, and book-accurate end for the trilogy's first major villain. But when Lee went to see the final theatrical cut, the scene was gone. Jackson, worried about the film's already epic length, had cut it entirely. For Lee, this wasn't just an edit, it was an act of profound disrespect. He was absolutely furious. He felt cutting the main villain's death from the final film was a baffling storytelling choice. The decision stung so badly that Lee publicly boycotted the film's premiere, creating a very public rift with Jackson. The betrayal, as Lee saw it, was twofold. It was a betrayal of the story and a betrayal of his contribution. Thankfully, the scene was restored for the extended edition DVD, and the 2 men did eventually reconcile. Lee even agreed to return as Saruman for the Hobbit trilogy, but not before calling Jackson and asking pointedly, "Am I still in the movie?" Jackson assured him he was. The incident, however, remained a scar, a deep wound inflicted over a story Lee had cherished for most of his life. The #1 spot on Christopher Lee's list isn't a single person, but a pervasive mindset he fought for most of his career: the lazy, unimaginative typecasting of Hollywood. After his stardom with Hammer films, Lee found himself in a gilded cage. He was an international star, but only a horror star. To the producers and casting directors, he was Dracula, and that's all they could see. This was a classically trained actor, fluent in multiple languages, with a presence perfect for kings, generals, and heroes. Yet the industry just kept sending him scripts for vampires and ghouls. His frustration was immense. In the mid-1970s, he made a life-changing decision. He left Britain and moved to Hollywood, determined to escape the horror genre and prove his versatility. And for a while it worked. He landed roles in mainstream films like Airport 77 and Steven Spielberg's comedy 1941, but the battle was never truly won. Even decades later, reporters would still call him a horror legend, a label he found reductive and insulting. He also held a deep contempt for where the horror genre was going. He found the rise of slasher films and so-called torture porn to be nauseating, believing true horror was about atmosphere and suggestion, not an avalanche of blood. This lifelong struggle against the industry's narrow-mindedness was the ultimate source of his professional discontent. It wasn't one person, it was an entire system that repeatedly failed to see the full scope of his talent. His iconic roles as Saruman and Count Dooku in his later years were a final triumphant vindication, proving that he was far too vast to be contained by any single genre. But the long, hard-fought war against the industry's lack of imagination was the defining conflict of his incredible career. Christopher Lee's career was a masterclass in talent, discipline, and sticking to your principles. These stories reveal the man behind the legend, a man who demanded the best from himself and from everyone around him. What do you think? Were Lee's standards too high, or was he right to hold his ground? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this look behind the silver screen, be sure to like and subscribe for more stories from Hollywood's hidden history. From the cheapening of Dracula at Hammer Films to the creative betrayal on the world's biggest movie set, Christopher Lee's professional grudges all came from one place: his profound respect for the art of storytelling. These weren't petty squabbles. They were the judgments of a man who saw his craft as a high calling. He was a veteran, a scholar, and an artist who believed in discipline and integrity. The conflicts he navigated, whether loud or silent, were his way of defending those principles in an industry that too often seemed to have none. In the end, these clashes reveal the uncompromising nature of a man who was every bit as formidable off-screen as he was on.